have everyone present and accounted for, so I'll go ahead and call to order the Board of County Commissioners Workshop for June 27th, 2023. The time is 9:31 a.m. Let's begin this morning by rising for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, I'd like to recognize our county manager to introduce today's topic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, commissioners and all in attendance. As you can see just by the title, on the title slide, the action plan development process, and I doubt there's anyone in the room who doesn't know what we're talking about today, but just in case. Glenn Sellier, who is an assistant county manager but is responsible for the newly created Office of Strategic Resource and Government Affairs, has assembled a team of people who are going to help us work through all of the administrative process that's required in order for us to, at some point, begin to spend the $1.1 billion allocated to Lee County directly from HUD. We all know that normally these CDBG-DR grants usually go to a state, wherever the disaster is. It could be the wildfires out west, it could be the Mississippi Valley floods, it can be, any disaster you can think of where that requires communities to recover. Normally these grants go to the state. It is rare for one of these to come directly to a local government. Normally it would be the Department of Economic Opportunity for the state of Florida, but it has come directly to Lee County. And I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse, to tell you the truth. It's a bit of a double-edged sword to try and determine how to spend this money in a way that will allow us to redevelop and recover. There are some flaws with the CDBG-DR process. And everybody knows that 70% of that money has to be spent on housing. In a low to moderate income range. And all the people in the low to moderate income range that had their homes destroyed during this storm, they need the money today, but it's not going to be available for a year or longer, it would seem, given everything that we have to do in advance of identifying the projects that the County Commission will ultimately have to approve. So, Commissioner, I think with that, I think that kind of sets us up for the conversation. And so, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. County Manager. So, prior to this meeting, I received notice from some local elected officials that they would be here today, and so I invited them to speak with us this morning. And so, at this time, I'd like to call them up and give them an opportunity to speak for about 3 minutes to us, commissioners, just to give us their feedback and their thoughts. And so, first, I'd like to call Mayor Gunter from the City of Cape Coral.
Thank you very much. For the record, Mayor John Gunter, City of Cape Coral. First, I'd like to thank the Commission for giving me the opportunity. I know that isn't normally your process. Thank you for giving me a couple minutes. First and foremost, I want to say it's a pleasure to work with the county on this recovery task force. There has been identified many unmet needs here in our county. Cape Coral also being one of those, and actually almost 50% of the unmet needs that we've identified so far, almost 50% of that is within the city of Cape Coral. So the needs for our community are large. This plan is vital to the meaningful and lasting recovery, not only for the city of Cape Coral, but for Lee County and all the other municipalities as well. I do have a few topics or a few questions that I wanted to identify in the slide presentation that you have today. On slide number 6, unmet needs analysis, as far as the local numbers, the city would ask maybe to have a little more defined analysis on that, exactly where the unmet needs are here within Lee County and what those numbers are. Also on slide 8, we have stakeholder and public engagement. And like I'd mentioned before, almost 50% of the unmet needs are in the city of Cape Coral that we've identified so far. And we do not have a public meeting in Cape Coral at all. And we would ask that the county consider having either a meeting in the city of Cape Coral or maybe a joint meeting with Pine Island and Cape Coral. We recognize there are some unmet needs in Pine Island, but maybe something similar to Burnt Store and Veterans Location. One thing that come to mind with me was maybe the German American Club. That way, we could have the city of Cape Coral and Pine Island in close proximity that could come and participate in that meeting. Also on slide 10, where it says program design delivery methods for the individual housing program, the city's main concern with the direct delivery model by the county could be confusing for the Cape Coral residents due to the potential of duplication and benefits. As you are aware, we do have a CDBG program. We've had it for many years. We have went through that process, so we're very familiar with how it needs to be run and what the regulations are. And we would ask if maybe we could do some type of a program where the city is a little more involved with that aspect. The city has demonstrated a capacity to run the CDBG programs almost over the last 10 years with a successful track record of grant management and compliance based on the experience. The city believes that we would be in the best interest for our residents in Cape Coral to utilize a sub-recipient delivery model to administer the individual programs in the city of Cape Coral. A sub-recipient delivery model approach, of course, within close coordination with the county for individual housing programs, will provide the highest level of management, compliance, and reduce the possibility of duplication of benefits and ensure the efficiency, coordination, and implementation of the program in our city. Additionally, a sub-recipient delivery model approach will reduce the county's workload by allowing the county to redirect resources to better serve other communities within Lee County. We have the staff, we have the manpower. And I think that's very important to recognize. Some municipalities do not have that, but in the city of Cape Coral, we do. Program design on slide 12, as far as notice of funding availability. Who will be a part of the recommending committee review? There is a process, and of course we know it eventually goes to the Board of County Commissioners, but the recommending committee review, we'd like to see and identify who that is and make sure that we're a part of that committee. In closing, we look forward to continuing to work with the county through this process. It's an honor to serve on the Hurricane Recovery Task Force, not only to fight for the needs of our city, but for all the cities and the counties throughout Lee County. Again, thank you, and I appreciate the time that you've given us today.
Mayor Gunter, thank you very much for your comments this morning. At this time, Councilman Chris Corey from Bonita Springs.
Record. My name is Chris Corey. I represent District 4 of the City of Bonita Springs and was selected by the City Council to represent Bonita Springs on the Resiliency Task Force. I'm not here to speak on behalf of Bonita Springs, but rather to try to put a little perspective into the process we're going through to come up with an action plan. So with that, I'll tell you a little story. When I was in Europe at the time of Hurricane Ian, when the disaster hit Hickory Island and Fort Myers Beach. I happened to be in Amsterdam. And as a result of being in Amsterdam, I learned what New Orleans did in terms of coming up with a new resiliency program with respect to its exposure to the Gulf and hurricanes. And what it did was to look around the world and see who has the best track record of dealing with surges and storms coming in off the ocean. And they found it to be the Dutch engineers. And the Dutch engineers were retained to rebuild the seawalls and the drainage systems of New Orleans. So while we are looking at subject matter experts within this plan development, I would encourage us to also take a look at and see what other cities have done that has been successful. I would encourage that with respect also to affordable housing. There's a very successful affordable housing project in Chicago. There are very affordable housing projects in Denver. I would just encourage everyone as we try to work through this as a combined Lee County, working together for resiliency and improving the lives of all of our residents, that we take advantage of what others have done and what others have learned in the process and go beyond what we may be thinking of strictly from a local standpoint. So that's my encouragement to the commission and to all those that are working on this project. Bonita Springs is thankful we're doing it. We look at this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but we also encourage the commission to think big in terms of solutions. There will be more grant funding coming down the road. Some of these projects will take years to accomplish, so I think we need to identify those areas and where it's going to attract additional grant funding to solve the problems that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. All right, at this time, that concludes the list of elected folks who had notified me before the meeting they would like to speak today. So, Commissioner Pendergrass, you're recognized.
Sure. I was like question the county manager. Roger, so again, thank you for your staff preparing all this stuff. So the question I've been asked before today, and I heard that obviously from Mayor Guttner to echo some of the comments I think some of the cities are under the impression that how the money's going to be used, and maybe hopefully today we can explain that to everyone so we have a clear understanding, because I'm getting calls every day from people and they're asking, how's the task force involved with this? I'm like, well, I'm being told they're not involved with this. So it's just, I feel like there's two different paths here, and I got people calling me last Friday from the task force asking why weren't they told about this meeting today? We were notified back on May 26th of this meeting. So I think it's really clear. Hopefully we can get that out today and let people understand what the purpose of this is and how this works and how the housing just is allocated based upon the housing needs for low-income housing and what qualifies for that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir, Mr.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm sure that we can help clarify all of those questions today. I think as Glenn gets into the presentation, some of that will become obvious, but if there are still questions when he finishes, then we'll be happy to answer those.
Like I said, I just want to make sure we get the money back in the community where it's needed.
Yes, sir.
Where obviously there's a lot of asks, and a lot of people want their, to be involved and engaged, and obviously to be involved with this for many reasons. But I'll make sure we actually get the money back to the community that needs it, and hopefully in the different parts of the community that's been, forgotten in the past, we get the money back to lower income minority communities.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
All right, at this time then, Commissioners, let's go ahead and begin with the presentation. And I believe it's Glenn Salyer who will do the presentation today. Glenn, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Commissioners, guests. We do appreciate this opportunity, and I think Roger introduced the item well, so allow me to just quickly thank our staff who have coalesced very quickly and taken us a long way already from the formalization of this allocation on May 18th to where we can have this discussion today, thanks to them. I also want to point out that Jeannie Sutton is here with me, and she's going to help clean up anything that I miss, and we will indeed try to answer all of your questions. The other thing I want to acknowledge up front is that we have tried to distill a lot of material to its bare essence here. So if I gloss over something or miss something that you want to talk about, please just stop me, and we will do that. And so what we do want to do today is just a real high-level review of what this funding is and how it's intended to be used, just as a refresher. Then we do want to talk about the gap that remains in our Hurricane Ian recovery, where we are today versus where we ultimately need to be. We want to cover stakeholder and public engagement that has already occurred to date, and then talk about what we propose for the future. We will spend some time talking about program design. You already heard some comments about what's being proposed, and that is the heart of the discussion. how we frame this program to get the projects done. So we'll spend some time there. We'll briefly talk about implementation, and then we will get to some baseline recommendations that staff is making for allocating these funds. And really, the goal of today's workshop is to get the board's direction to make sure that we are on the right path here, or to make any adjustments that the board desires. So the 10,000-foot overview, of course, of these funds, the $1.1 billion direct allocation to Lee County, this is HUD money. So it's no surprise that the focus areas are housing and urban development. Add to that the rules require that we spend a minimum of 70% of these funds on low, moderate income households, or to benefit low, moderate income households. And I think that really is sort of the bottom line of this program. If you keep those things in mind, that will take you a long way in terms of what we have to accomplish. The Federal Register notice that was issued May 18th spells out the rules for this allocation. I just point that out. There's a lot in there for people to digest. And we do show here the income tables to show what it means to be low or very low income. The very low income is shown here because we will use that for project prioritization, which you will see later on in the presentation. And I do want to address up front the notion of, I'm going to call it LMI for short, low, moderate income. So I do want to address LMI waivers. This has come up early and often. I can assure you that we have had many discussions with HUD headquarters about how we would pursue such a waiver. And really, I'm just going to read a little language to you here that sort of bottom lines that for us. To ultimately get a waiver, we have to demonstrate that the LMI population's disaster recovery needs have already been met, that the non-LMI needs are disproportionately greater, and that the community lacks other resources to serve them. So we are proposing a process that would walk us through the steps that ultimately, if there's money remaining, we can demonstrate to HUD that we do need some more flexibility for these funds. But in order to set expectations early, it's important to say that that is often a years-long process. That is not something that they will approve right out of the gate.
Lynn, real quick, back on that slide. So this may be a silly question to ask, but so I see very low, I see low. Is moderate income another category? And what does that look like on this table?
It is, and the low moderate income, in a way, is a little bit of a misnomer in that the 70% rule applies to 80% or less of area median income. So that bottom row, I mean, that's really the germane number for today's discussion. Now, moderate, I think, is really up to, I think of it at least in terms of up to 120% of area median income. And we don't have that for you here, but we can certainly send you those numbers as well.
Okay, so it's kind of misleading because you're saying we need to spend 80%, we need to spend $775 million on people who are at that 80% or below. So really it's not low and moderate income households, it's just 70% needs to go to low income households or below then.
That really would be more accurate at this stage of the game. As we progress, again, we go through the process, we can demonstrate that we still have unaddressed needs, money left over, and that we've satisfied these, then we can move to the moderate income benefit. But that's a great point, thank you. In terms of eligible activities, I think everyone is generally aware of the types of projects that can be done with these funds, and so I won't spend a great deal of time on that. We will address this again at the end with the allocation recommendations. I do want to focus a little bit on the timeline. You've seen this many times before, but just to reiterate where we are now, the board on Tuesday ratified our financial and grant management certifications. The board chair will sign those hopefully today. We will have those to HUD well in advance of our July 21st deadline, so thank you for that. Really what we're pointing to now is getting direction in order to craft the draft action plan that will go to the board on Tuesday, August 1st. Hopefully we will be able to publish that plan that very day. That begins a public comment period that will last the entire month of August. We will solicit input from all interested parties and we'll talk about that as well. That then would allow us time to come back to the board at its September 5th meeting, get further direction based on that public input, make the final modifications to the plan that would be presented to the board for adoption on September 19th. That will allow us to make our required submissions by September 20th in order to meet HUD's deadlines. That then triggers an initial review period by HUD. They have up to 60 days to look at the plan, make comments, ask for modifications, and that can be a back and forth process. So in terms of rolling projects out, to Roger's point, it's a little unclear at this point what those dates look like, but please know that we are working towards project rollout just as fast as can possibly be done with these monies.
Go ahead, Ron.
Glenn, just to want to make sure that that we're clear, the timeline and the dates and actions to be taken, those are HUD guidelines. Those are not, maybe and if and assuming nothing goes wrong. Those are the guidelines and the time schedule handed to us by HUD, yes?
Yes, sir. In terms of that September 20th date, that's the 120th day from the effective date of the Federal Register notice. And unless we ask for an extension, that is when the plan is due to HUD. Yes, sir. So talking about the gap of where we stand in terms of Hurricane Ian recovery and where we ultimately want to get to, HUD looked at some preliminary state-level data to formulate this allocation, and you can see that in the top table here. They obviously indicated housing as being the biggest unmet need for the community. A little light on infrastructure from our view of things, but again, they were using some preliminary state-level data. And when you add the three urgent need allocation categories together, by statute, they now add 15% to that for mitigation projects. So that is a statutory set-aside. And that mitigation set-aside is important because it does not require a tie back to the storm. So for these other categories, we have to tie projects back to the storm. We have to show what the impacts from Hurricane Ian were to make them eligible. For mitigation projects that are strictly mitigation, you don't have to demonstrate that. And that gets us to the $1.1 billion total allocation. Now, since HUD released these figures to us, we have been collecting our own localized data and working with Haggerty Consulting to put together a more updated estimate of local unmet needs. And you see that in the second table here. And really, I want to point out a couple of things. So we're using a lot of data sources, FEMA Public Assistance, SBA, Federal Highway Administration, you name it. But we're also using the submissions that the long-term recovery task force has collected from municipalities, the school district, others. And then we have been conducting our own consultative sessions with stakeholders to collect projects as well. And so we're trying to integrate all of that into a more updated analysis. And I think really these numbers are going to continue to change as we get data, as we craft the plan, and as we amend the plan over the life of the program. But the two main takeaways I think here are, one, right now we're looking at a minimum $8.5 billion unmet need. That's a conservative estimate. And so it clearly dwarfs the total allocation of DR funding available to us. And so one, that should set some expectations. And two, hopefully it sets the stage for us to go advocate for additional funding from lots of different sources. And then I think the second thing to note here about this table is the dramatic increase in the percentage of infrastructure need versus what was originally proffered by HUD. That's not to be unexpected. They would expect us to see that kind of change. So any questions about the unmet needs?
I have a question about that. It's like going back to Mayor Gunter's comment on where I think we could actually build a team of advocates that could come help us ask for more resources by bringing the city partners into that. Is there a way that we could break out where these unmet needs are so that they could understand their own individual unmet needs?
Yes, sir. We do have a number of different ways to look at that. We have lots of maps showing where the most damaged structures are, for instance, and then overlaid with not only LMI areas, but just income demographics in general. And when we publish the unmet needs analysis, which is incorporated into the action plan, you will see 100 some odd pages of data tables and maps, very granular analysis of where these needs are. And we're happy to share that data as we build it. It's just, as you can imagine at this stage, it's an ongoing process.
Okay, so when will that be published? Is that when we put the action plan, the draft action plan out?
So the draft action plan will need to be published, I want to say July 24th, something like that. Don't hold me to the exact day, but
And that's when we'll get that unmet needs analysis, that 100 pages worth of stuff?
Yes, sir, it will be incorporated in that. And we can share data prior to that, of course.
Yeah, Commissioner Pendergrass, I apologize.
Thank you, Glenn. This is the information I was looking for, because that's what I was trying to find out earlier is, for example, all the work people are putting with the task force, that information is being gathered and is being collected, put together with this. So that's, I'm trying to understand their role, because a lot of people are wondering what the purpose of all this is. And at the end of the day, hopefully we can get this answer question. Somebody that lost their home or needed housing, how do they benefit? How do they get to these funds? After everything's submitted, we get the grants approved. How do they actually apply that money back to the families here in Lee County?
Yes, sir. And if we don't adequately address that specific question in the presentation, I think it will lay it out, but if it doesn't, just remind me and we'll step through that specifically.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
Commissioners, also, we've had a couple of meetings with all 6 city managers. And so, and one of the topics of conversation is eventually, as we get closer to the next legislative season, is a joint lobbying effort for those issues of common concern. The community speaks louder with all those voices than just Lee County.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to stakeholder and public engagement. A lot of work has been done already, of course. The Long-Term Recovery Task Force has collected a lot of information, and they conducted 16 town halls, I believe, Commissioner Ruane, throughout the county. They've collected a lot of information from residents and asked residents, in fact, to prioritize the needs. And you see that on the right-hand column here. The left-hand column, these are staff-level consultation meetings that HUD requires and that we would want to do anyway. So you've got local governments, nonprofits, county departments, other stakeholders. And while we didn't ask those parties to prioritize their needs per se, what we've done here is we've shown you the amount of projects submitted. So the greatest need in dollar terms that was submitted to us was infrastructure, followed by housing. And that aligns with the priorities that came through the task force town hall meetings as well. Now, going forward, I mentioned the public comment period for the draft action plan. We do intend for that to be the entire month of August. We would accept public comments via the website, by email, snail mail, and then, of course, in person at public meetings. And we are proposing a series of public meetings in unincorporated Lee County. And we've tried to disperse them geographically as well as concentrate on some of the vulnerable populations and low, moderate income demographics in our community. Now, none of these proposed meetings are within incorporated municipalities. And so the discussions that we've had with city managers and their staffs is that we would welcome them to conduct those meetings in their jurisdictions, and we would be happy to support those in any way that we can. And I think there's a lot of information we can provide that will help with that. And they can even do that at a regular council meeting if they so choose, or they could have a special meeting, whatever their desire. The other option would be that we would offer is direct your residents to one of these locations that's in close proximity to your municipality. But I think that's something we need feedback on from the commission to see if this aligns with your expectations of us.
Glenn, I think thinking about that plan, I understand, geographically why you would set it up the way you have. One concern I have, though, is consistency of message and presentation. And so if there is going to be a presentation that happens inside of a city, I think it would benefit all of us if it was done by the same folks who are doing the presentations in the unincorporated areas so that there's consistency of message. so that the audience hears the same thing no matter where they live. And I think that's probably, I would prefer that we go ahead and add some meetings inside the cities then with our team. So again, it's a consistent message. But Commissioner Greenwell, I think, yeah, go ahead and hit your.
I think it's appropriate time to also talk about one of the things that, Cape Coral, obviously, so much of our area was impacted. But I want to make sure one of the places that we don't forget, or some of the places we don't forget, is that Caloosahatchee River goes a long way. And we can't forget the low-income areas that we have in North Fort Myers and the shores and Alga and North Alga and then Alva, all along the Caloosahatchee River. That is our workforce, a lot of those folks out there. And that's a lot of the area that was really damaged, too. So I just want to make sure that we kind of get that on record, not to forget that it's not just the barrier islands that got impacted. It was, all the way to the locks and beyond. So those areas, that is a large part of our workforce. I want to make sure that we pay attention to that area.
Oh, Commissioner Ruane.
Sure. Just to add on to both speakers, we've obviously received information north of $8.5 billion from all the stakeholders that have given that. And to be consistent with that, somehow we need to incorporate them. I understand we have a responsibility to unincorporate Lee County, but if we don't have it all inclusive, and it's going to be difficult for them to be part of the team or feel like they're part of the team. Since we've asked them to submit their projects, we're north of $8.5 billion. So to have them inclusive, I certainly would think we would need to have more public meetings.
I think one request we probably would make, Commissioners, to see if this aligns with your expectations, is that we'd be happy to do what you all just said. Our team can make the presentations, we can supply whatever information or data the municipalities want. If they could handle the logistics within their own municipalities, that would be a big help to us. But that's something we can work out. I think I understand the direction, so we'll work with our counterparts to make that happen.
So just to clarify, you're saying they could handle the date, time, place, and advertising of it. You guys could provide the content of the program.
If that's acceptable, that would be preferred.
I mean, that sounds fair to me. I don't,
Yeah. So bringing content, will you have any role in that meeting? Or
Yes, sir.
Provide the content.
We can provide the content. We can make presentations, whatever.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about program design. Again, this is really the heart of the discussion, other than perhaps the funding decisions. And so we'll take each of these in turn, but we do need to talk about subrecipient versus direct delivery methods, which were touched upon in the comments before the presentation. There are also different options for how we craft the action plan. We can identify specific projects to include in the plan, or we can create program buckets that allow for future identification of the projects themselves. And you can see the categories for which we've are recommending that methodology. We'll talk about eligibility criteria for both the end users and the potential subrecipients. And then we'll move into that prioritization criteria that was discussed as part of the LMI discussion. So starting with the delivery methods, what we are recommending is that really everything outside of individually occupied housing be delivered via a subrecipient model. So if a municipality wants to undertake an infrastructure program, if that project is ultimately selected, they would be a subrecipient. They would run with that project. Obviously, we have to provide technical assistance. HUD requires that we monitor, report, ensure compliance, et cetera. But that would be their project on their own terms within the confines of the program itself. For individual housing, we are proposing a direct delivery model, meaning that the county would be responsible for everything from application intake to eligibility determination, duplication of benefits determination, overseeing construction, handling case management compliance, the whole thing. And we've had a lot of discussions with HUD about this. Their idea by giving us a direct allocation was not to create 7 different individual housing programs and duplicate all of that effort and overhead and expense What they're really looking for is a unified model of delivery for this type of program. And honestly, it does make sense to us as well. And what we would do is we would work with all of the municipalities to, we can brand it as a municipal project within their jurisdiction. We can do intake within the cities themselves. We can have mobile application units. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done so that to the end user, it's a pretty seamless process. And in terms of duplication of benefits, again, this program would only be for those houses directly damaged by Hurricane Ian. So it really doesn't involve the entitlement funds for an individual municipality if they don't want it to. They can preserve those funds to benefit households that don't have direct Ian impacts. I hope that explains what we're looking for on the direct delivery method versus subrecipient, but glad to address any questions along these lines.
Mr. Chair, Glenn made a point just a minute ago about projects that might be infrastructure projects within the cities, and in which case the city would become a subrecipient and manage those projects, but the county is still required to monitor and report to HUD and all of that. I think we don't want the cities to think that we're trying to get in their business, because that is not the case. It is simply that HUD requires it, number one, and number two, all of this spending will be audited sooner or later, and the county retains the liability for any audit failures. So if there are dollars that are inadvertently misspent, the county becomes liable for those dollars. So it's partly required by HUD, but the other is our obligation to the board to make sure that we avoid the liability to the fullest extent that we can.
Yes.
Commissioner Ruane?
Yes, sir. I will try to do that. So for the subrecipient model in particular, let's start there. So what we'd like to do is solicit for a staff augmentation and implementation vendor who would provide a few services. One, they would augment our staff. They would embed with our team and become an everyday part of what we do. So that's the umbrella program management piece. Devising policies and procedures, helping with monitoring and oversight, reporting, all of the things that have to be done program-wide. That vendor would help us do those things. In addition, they would help us implement the projects that are not individual homeowner-occupied programs. So infrastructure, planning, public services, and new affordable housing development, they would help us with that implementation, because that is all subrecipient management. And so they all kind of coalesce. And then the second vendor there, the direct delivery model, this is a different animal. This is doing individual occupied home. This contractor has to have all of that expertise in order to take those applications, vet them for eligibility, decide whether or not there's a duplication of benefits, secure the general contractors, manage the supply chain issues that come with doing all of this at once in a booming housing market, handle all the case management, and oversee compliance. Now, we as staff, and back to that first vendor, we still have to monitor that at the program level. But that second vendor really would be the day-to-day boots on the ground implementation of rebuilding the houses individually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so follow-up, if I will.
Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner.
So
Okay, good. Sorry, yeah, I didn't see your mic on earlier.
it is, sorry. So follow-up, it's your team, it's Hagerty. Are there any other skill sets that we might need that we currently are not aware of as county commissioners to do some of the case management, construction, or any of those silos?
We do. We need, so what we're proposing really is two different solicitations for those kinds of companies that bring CDBG-DR specific expertise to bear to help us with these two buckets. again, the first one is really that overall program management, and the second one is really reconstructing our housing stock that was damaged.
So do you have a timeline on solicitation? I know certainly through this process and interacting with some of the people at DEM, there seems to be only a handful of companies that have specific skill set to address all these needs. So do you have a particular time frame in mind?
Yes, sir. If the board likes the direction we're headed today, quite honestly, we would issue our first solicitation within days. Because if we don't get that process moving, we are likely to find ourselves in a situation where HUD approves our plan and we're still at the starting blocks, so to speak, in terms of implementation. We don't want that to happen. It's going to take a few months to procure these vendors. So if we get the green light, we'll issue that first solicitation probably within days, and then the second one will follow shortly thereafter within the matter of probably a couple of weeks.
Another follow-up. So in the process you're identifying, you've kind of gone through the responsibilities of intake, eligibility, construction, and indicated where you might need assistance. And I'd imagine that's more than one vendor to provide said assistance.
Well, what we envision is two vendors, one for those top-level bucket items, and then the second for the housing. But I think maybe the point you're getting at is that second vendor, they are going to have to hire multiple contractors. Yes, absolutely.
Subcontractors to bring the skill set.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, they'll have to recruit from out of state, I'm sure, given the housing market.
Yeah, looking at the complexity of this, obviously there are certain silos that a particular company brings. So to your point, you'd have a vendor, and then under that vendor, you'd have subcontractors that obviously bring that skill set. Collectively, we'd address. I guess what I'm looking for is just what we have the ability to do, what we have with the outside vendor we have, what actual responsibilities would we be going out for RFP or solicitation, just to understand the scope and how we're trying to identify those. But this is exactly what I thought we were going to get to at some point in time. Thank you.
Okay, yes, my pleasure. Thank you.
Last question before we move on from this one, just because it was raised, you know, and I can certainly understand. I'm sympathetic to the comment that was put forward by Cape Coral, but I assume other cities also have raised the issue as well about the direct delivery model. And so, you know, the reason why I could understand a city saying, you know, we have a lot of staff, we're very sophisticated, we have the ability to do this, and we do it already. You know, so we could handle doing our own direct delivery model within our city. I think it's a completely valid comment, right? I think what I heard you say today, though, is that HUD would prefer we don't do it that way because it duplicates a lot of overhead and a lot of programs. They would prefer that there would be one countywide program. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's the feedback. We certainly recognize that municipalities could do that work, absolutely. That said, we are looking for a unified program with the same requirements and specifications throughout. We don't want to compete for the same resources if we don't have to. And there is the overriding concern that you're duplicating a program 7 times over, you know, for each city and unincorporated Lee County.
Sure. And in the end, then, it sounds like it will make the auditing process a lot smoother and hopefully be a protection for the taxpayers who live both inside cities and outside of cities so that that money doesn't get potentially clawed back if something weren't reported correctly.
That is the idea, yes, sir.
Okay, so I understand that approach. The only thing then that I would ask is if you could just kind of describe your vision for how we'll work with the cities on that model. You mentioned potentially branding. I mean, would they be able to help? Are we envisioning having sites where people would go to make application and similar to like what we had with disaster recovery centers and things like that? What are we envisioning here, and how would that partnership look with the cities?
Yes, sir. There is a lot to be worked out in that regard, and we do have many months to do that before we could ever roll this program out. And so we would propose to work very closely with each city to craft really a customized solution where we can, especially for application intake. We absolutely expect to have physical locations where applications can be submitted. There will be online options, of course. But in terms of getting the word out and branding and publicizing, that's something that we'd want to work with each individual municipality to suit their needs as best we can.
All right, thanks. Looks like I think that's answered all the questions on that one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so one option for the action plan is to designate specific activities that will be funded. For those that can be identified specifically enough, that is an option. And so we have recommended some here for specific inclusion in the plan. The first one is an HMGP matching program. So all of our jurisdictions have submitted or will submit to the state applications for hazard mitigation grant project funding. Those do require a 25% local match. That is a tough ask in the current environment when we have all of these other unmet needs. And so we are proposing to use this funding to supply the match for all entities that are awarded HMGP projects by the state. A couple things I do want to point out about that. One is that most of those projects are unlikely to be LMI qualifying. And so right off the top, we have to understand that 10% of our 30% urgent need allowance is going to be used up by that. But, you know, it seems worth the effort because there's a lot of bang for the buck, and we're all going to be looking for matching funds. I think the second point is just to keep in mind that infrastructure includes both critical facilities and pure mitigation projects. So if there's questions about that, we can talk about it.
One question I had, I thought early on there was some discussion of the state picking up the local 25%. So is the HMGP money, it's federal money, 75% of it is federal money, and then 25% is local money. I thought there was a discussion about the state maybe picking up that 25% on behalf of the locals. Did that go anywhere? Am I remembering it correctly?
I think, Commissioner, you're remembering it correctly in that we were advocating for that during both the special sessions and regular session. Our understanding right now is that the state is supplying the local match, if you will, for FEMA public assistance projects, but that they have not yet designated an HMGP matching fund. So if that continues to be the case, we just want to be prepared.
Okay. Commissioner.
Thanks, Glenn. And obviously, it's been a desire of ours. It's a list that certainly legislators have asked us to continue to update as we have needs to do that. Some of us will have the opportunity to see Senator Albritton later. It's an ask that's on our list. Thank you.
And I think another point to that would be if we're ultimately successful in securing that HMGP match from the state, we can amend the plan and use these monies then for something else. And I probably haven't said it enough, but these plans do get amended periodically throughout the life of the program. So we're not setting this once and for all and it's done. It is expected that our needs will change over time and that we will amend the plan. So within the planning bucket, we are recommending 3 very specific projects, one being the Long-Term Recovery Task Force and its efforts, the second being this action plan development itself. And then the third, I'd like to ask Jeannie Sutton to describe to the board, because this is a throwback to something we tried to accomplish before, didn't quite get there, and we think now this provides the necessary resources. Jeannie?
Thank you. So the Behavioral Health System of Care Plan was something that was brought up a few years back, I believe, with American Rescue Plan funds. Unfortunately, that project never came to fulfillment. So we'd like to propose adding some funds in the planning section of this action plan to carry out a study to analyze our behavioral health system here within the county, and then some additional funds in public services to actually make improvements to make our behavioral health system a comprehensive system of care. So right now, our system, as you may be aware, has multiple wait lists across multiple different providers. There's really no one single point of access into the behavioral health care system. So similar to what we had proposed in the past, we'd like to do some planning and then provide some funds to be able to create that cohesive system where someone in behavioral health crisis has one phone number to call or one place to visit to be able to access the services that they need, and then be able to be carried through the system and make sure that their outcomes are improved.
Question, we tried this idea with ARPA dollars and then something broke down. So have we identified what broke down and what's going to be different this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a couple of partners at the table in the past, and additionally, in addition to that, the ARPA funds had to be moved around slightly, as you remember a few weeks ago. So a combination of those two things, the project just never took off. So this time around, we do plan to procure a consultant to take a look at do some more planning and develop a real true implementation plan for this.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Commissioner, I do think we ran into the issue of not having that really detailed implementation plan, and therefore it was a little difficult for potential providers to step up and say, we can do that. This would give us a baseline so we know exactly what we have to do, and then we are proposing under public services implementation funding as well, which we didn't have enough of before. We may have to bring an outside entity in from outside Lee County with the capacity to deliver this kind of program. So that's what was missing before.
Yeah, okay, I'm on board with the idea that we need help with behavioral health services here in our county. I think there's a lot of evidence for that. I just want to know what we're doing differently this time to make it successful. That's all. Okay.
Yes, sir.
The final item in the public services section is the continuation of the unmet needs long-term recovery group. So you may remember that there was a competitive solicitation in February of this year with the regular entitlement CDBG funds to select a lead agency to provide individual case management to disaster victims with continued unmet needs. So Catholic Charities was identified during that process as having sufficient capacity to take on that project and has been carrying that out since March or April of this year. So they're actually in the process right now of doing callbacks to about 2,000 households that have identified continued unmet needs to see how they can connect them to services. So we'd like to propose providing some funds to continue that process as part of the DR action plan.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. Okay, so for the bulk of the action plan, we are proposing not specifically identified projects per se, but sort of your traditional grant process whereby we issue notices of funding availability, potential applicants submit their projects for consideration, presumably a set of objective criteria identify the most cost-effective and desirable projects, so those rise to the top and ultimately get funded. Now, here again, this is a pretty high level of generality because we will have to work through all of this process with the board in the coming months to say, how exactly are projects vetted and then ultimately approved. And what we envision is a process whereby there is a technical review at the outset for eligibility, feasibility, et cetera. And those would be staff experts, augmentation vendor assistance, et cetera. And then that information would be submitted to a recommending committee for review. Now, again, we'll have to work through the board, with the board to determine who sits on that committee, what responsibilities does it have, so on and so forth. And we have a lot of time to do that. But ultimately, it will have to come to the board, whatever method we select, for final approval. The board will have the final say on which specific activities get funded. And then to the right of the process column, you see a row of criteria that we would propose to include ultimately in our processes and procedures to evaluate these projects. And I don't think there's anything there that would surprise anybody. but I'm happy
Looks
to.
like it makes a lot of sense. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on the recommending committee, who they'll be, where they'll meet, how that process, who prepares the information for them, all that?
Well, as I say, Commissioner, those are all to be determined. We need to work with the board to decide all of that. We have a lot of different models that we've used in the past. We can look to other places that have administered DR funding. It can go a lot of different ways. But the one thing I can say is what we're proposing is that the technical review that is done by subject matter experts is submitted to that committee for their consideration. So you'd have a staff and CDBG-DR subject matter expert driven process at the outset to make sure the programs are eligible. And then they also would put together a package for each proposed project that the committee could consider as it goes through its evaluation and recommendations.
Are we at least, do you have is it going to be citizens? Is it going to be government people? Is it going to be a mixture?
Honestly, Commissioner, we've seen all those models. And ideally, I do think you include people with some expertise in these matters. So it's not necessarily, in fact, it probably should not be a single recommending committee, but rather there should be a committee for each of the program buckets. And you should include some technical expertise for that particular bucket of funding. But we're not really to the stage of coming to you with any specific recommendations on what that committee makeup should be. That would be down the road after you've told us which categories to even pursue.
Just to follow up, so I agree with the process. You have a threshold, you have a technical review committee, you basically have a recommending committee. We have some timelines associated with this that we need to know. We're on break. I don't know if there's any opportunities to have multiple vettings through this. Don't know if procurement and or vendors, as you go through the technical expertise, perhaps one option is two parts. One, to initially throw it to the task force. Two, to come back to the commission. They're ultimately the body that does this. So just trying to understand the timeline and really what we need to achieve in the ultimate goal. So if our goal is July or August, here's the things we need to do. We're on break. How do we achieve that?
Well, I would say, Commissioner, for that left-hand column for process, that does not necessarily need to be fleshed out in detail by that time frame. We've got some time to really craft what that looks like. So long as there's some general consensus that, yes, we want to see a process like this, that gets us where we need to be for August. And then we can come back to you and really dig into the nuts and bolts with some more specific recommendations for you about, the details of all of that.
And maybe I was trying to be too inclusive to have these items identified in your RFP or your solicitation. It needs to go back. You said any day, so I'm trying to understand what is any day, what criteria we're trying to have, how do we get the technical expertise, how do we get through I'm just trying to understand the steps.
Yes, sir.
For clarity.
No, that makes sense. So the scope for the solicitation for the program management augmentation vendor that we talked about, we are crafting tasks that require technical expertise in every one of the eligible funding buckets, even the ones that we're not recommending, in case the board decides to go there at some point in time. So we will be sure to bring on a vendor who has done this in many areas, knows how to do it with DR, can work with our staff to make the process the best it can be.
So this process that's on the board you see separate than the actual solicitation?
Yes, sir. This would be, so this is after approval of the action plan, when we're into program rollout phase.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we would say, here's a notice of funding availability for planning. And if you want to do some planning, submit your proposal, and that will be evaluated through this process.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, so now we'll talk about eligibility criteria. I'm going to start with end user eligibility, and then I'm going to follow that with subrecipient eligibility. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, even though there's a bunch of verbiage here. For housing, if it's individual occupied housing, you qualify those by household income. But for new housing development, the key really is reserving 51% or more of the units for low-income end users, and essentially that's the way to qualify your project. For infrastructure projects, you have to define the service area that is benefited by the infrastructure, and that service area needs to include 51% or more of low-income households. That is probably going to be a challenge for us in many respects, and so then that goes back again to the process that we're laying out so that we can work through the steps we need in order to get some flexibility down the road. The clientele eligibility, just an example of where this comes into play is on the public services bucket, the mental behavioral system, for instance. The folks who would be looking for those kinds of services essentially are automatically qualified under HUD guidelines. And then the last category I want to spend just a minute on, because it really is a reflection of the economic revitalization program. We are not recommending any projects to you today within that bucket, and there are some reasons for that. The first one of which is, for most of those grants directly to an individual business, it requires the creation or maintenance of jobs for low, moderate income employees. Those then have to be maintained for a period of years. The business has to account for and report on them continuously. And if any point in the future those jobs go away, we have to go back and claw back the money. That is going to be a difficult proposition to qualify those businesses, to monitor them, and then no one wants to have to go try to get money back from them if it doesn't work out. And if you've been involved in job creation incentives before, you know how that fluctuates over time. I would also just add, HUD has informed us that this is their highest risk category by far, not even close. This is where the greatest recapture of funding generally comes into play. And so what we are recommending instead, commissioners, is that we concentrate on housing and infrastructure as a way to benefit our business community. Our economy overall is still strong. We do think that housing workforce, housing potential customers, supplying public infrastructure that these businesses rely on is going to be the best way to benefit the economy with this specific funding. Now, eligibility for subrecipients, here's what we're proposing: new housing development, municipalities, housing authorities, both for-profit and nonprofit developers. Whoever has the best projects, those get funded. For critical facilities and infrastructure, we are suggesting that only municipalities, that includes the county, of course, be eligible applicants. And really, we're taking a page out of DEO's playbook on this one. This is how they did it for DR funds. Lots of reasons for it. One is the municipalities do administer CDBG funds. They know how this works. A lot of your other potential applicants would have no idea, and they wouldn't have the capacity necessarily to manage these funds appropriately. Secondly, if the municipality wants to partner with a non-government entity, that's completely acceptable. There are ways to do that, and that ensures that the municipality wants that project within their jurisdiction, is an active partner in it, and is going to work with us through the DR process, and that's really what we're looking for. So it isn't to say that non-local government projects can't be done. It's just that we're looking for the municipalities to be the applicants themselves and partner with other entities if that's something they want to see in their cities. And then for the planning funds, we are suggesting a fairly wide array of potential applicants. Part of the reason for that is the risk is much lower. These funding amounts are typically much smaller than the infrastructure projects. It'll be easier for us to help non-experienced recipients through the process. So any feedback on what we're suggesting for subrecipient eligibility? Okay, all right. I will move on. We can come back to any of this stuff. Now we're on the prioritization piece, and we're just using the individual housing project as our example here. So the left side really just shows you the steps that we have to go through for this project. It's the right side that we want to focus on here. And what we're suggesting is that for this program, as well as all of the others other than, say, planning, for instance, or public services perhaps, we go through a very particularized prioritization process so that we hit the very lowest income beneficiaries first, followed by the next lowest income demographic or those households that have other identified vulnerabilities. And we ultimately work our way to a point where if we have money left, we can start benefiting households above 80% of AMI. And again, that ensures that we meet the intent of the program, number one, and number two, that if we do have funds left over, we can demonstrate to HUD that we've satisfied all of those needs, and now it's time for some additional flexibility and we can move on. Any questions about that? Okay, we're getting close, I promise. Implementation, we won't talk a lot about this since we had a chance to respond to Commissioner Ruane's questions. These tasks are not necessarily linear, as might be suggested by the slide, but some of them we're working on already, just know that. Others really are program management oriented, and that's why we'd be soliciting for the augmentation vendor to help us. Okay, final thing, project allocations. You saw that we've gone through the unmet needs analysis to update that. We've gone through listening sessions and project intake, if you will. And so the other piece that we've married to that and tried to balance is what we've learned about best practices. So we've talked to lots of grantees across the country, and of course, lots of conversations with HUD. First and foremost, and literally everyone that we've talked to has said, streamline your program. Everybody will want to do everything possible. There are a lot of things you can do with this money. We recognize right up front that what we're suggesting does not include all of the needs in the community. However, if we tried to do everything, some of those projects probably just wouldn't get off the ground. There's too much administrative burden, too much cost, and we'd be diluting the impact of those bigger projects that we do want to accomplish. So with that in mind, here's our baseline recommendation for funding. It includes all of the things we've already talked about. One thing I haven't mentioned, well, two things I haven't mentioned. I haven't mentioned home buyer purchasing assistance. That would be down payment and closing cost assistance for qualified buyers. Nor have I mentioned voluntary residential buyouts. The idea there would be we would start with repetitive loss properties if property owners want to sell those and get out from under that flood risk. The other thing I want to point out about this slide is the public facilities and infrastructure category. That does collapse sort of those critical facilities as well as that mitigation set aside. So just keep in mind that's two different things combined into one. So if you back out the mitigation set aside, you're really talking about 20% of the allocation going to other infrastructure projects, not even quite 20. And then the last thing I do want to talk about real quick is program administration allocation. We've gotten lots of questions about this, as you can imagine. The first point about that would be the program administration is really for all of those umbrella tasks that have to be done across the CDBG-DR implementation. For individual projects, in other words, a subrecipient who undertakes a project, all of their costs are built into the project itself. It's called an activity delivery cost, and they are made whole through the project itself, not through the administration funds. The second thing to keep in mind is these administration funds have to cover lots of different things, and we are going to have at least a 6-year program here. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about that I do want to mention is if we undertake a project that doesn't ultimately come to fruition, for some reason it falls by the wayside, the work that was done on that project has to be accounted for out of the administration funds. You can't use the project bucket if it doesn't actually come to fruition. So you sort of have to keep those monies aside as your insurance policy, if you will, in case there are any hiccups throughout the life of the program. And so I think with that, that's a lot. I'll leave it there. We'll try to answer any questions that you have of us. And keeping in mind that we are seeking your direction today to make sure we're on the right path, any adjustments you want us to make.
Commissioner Pendergrass?
Hey, Glenn, I have a couple questions real quick. Can some of the funds for the administrative part of it be used to help some of the cities? You obviously look at Fort Myers Beach. We're here in our air-conditioned building, we're working, we have staff. But you take the city of like Fort Myers Beach or even other cities that are overwhelmed like now with permitting, like Cape Coral. Can some of these funds be used to help the administrative process to get to that, to get there as far as getting funds to their areas?
No, sir, I'm afraid they really can't. It's not for general government processes or structures even. So like City Hall, I know there's needs there, but you can't use these funds for that kind of activity.
Another question, the slide before had critical public facilities, on number 2, public facilities infrastructure. I know we're in the process of dealing with they had damage to the Civic Center. I know we've been looking, really haven't talked about what we're going to do yet with the Civic Center. That could be a shelter for the future. Could that be that money could be used to rebuild the Civic Center up to new standards?
A shelter is a potentially eligible expense, yes. I think the trick there that I want to point out to the board is that it's not an LMI project. You would think because every low moderate income household in the county could use that shelter that it might be, but we know from experience it doesn't work that way. We tried that with hardening Hertz Arena with the Irma DR money. DEO said, yep, that sounds good. HUD came in years later and said, no, that's not an LMI benefit. Thankfully, they had enough urgent need allocation left that we could still do the project, but that's just something we have to keep in mind. But shelters are eligible.
Okay, thank you.
Follow up to Commissioner Pendergrass's question. So understand your answer. If we were able to have the legislator obviously assist us in some of the funding where we don't need the hazard money to do, would the hazard money potentially be eligible for the Civic Center?
You mean as a mitigation project? Jeannie, do you have any insight on that? I mean, I guess I would say potentially.
So if I understand you today, one of the big asks we're going to do is make sure the legislator understands just how critical keeping the independence of the hazard mitigation money so we have ultimate opportunities to recover. And is there any way to further delineate the 55 in administration, any way to give us any type of indication of how that might look like, 5 here, 10 there, 50, just curious.
Oh, in terms of a projected expenditure plan?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So we ultimately will submit that with an implementation plan that will be due to HUD at the same time as the action plan. So we don't have that for you today, but
No. And
we will get it to you.
I'm not looking for it today. I'm just hoping. I think people could appreciate just how many years of work you're all going to have to do, and the various players that are going to be involved. So I think it's a big number, but I think when you look at the responsibilities that one has and the different expertise we're going to bring in, I think it'll dilute it very quickly and have clarity.
Yes, sir.
So, and then my last follow-up. So is part of your direction today that you'd like us to give you the okay to go to, solicitation and move forward and bring in the expertise necessary?
Yes, we want to make sure that makes sense to the board and comports with your vision for this program, number one, and then number two, make sure we have any input you need to give us for crafting the draft action plan, which again, plenty of time to change the draft even once but we do need to get to August 1st with a draft. So
That makes sense to me.
I guess the only question I think I'll ask, and I know it's kind of like a crystal ball question, but if everything goes as you laid it out in your timeline, the $660 million, I could see residents at home hearing about this part of it on the news, owner and renter, occupied housing, rehabilitation and reconstruction. I need that right now if I'm a resident, who got wiped out. When could we start to see some of that actually go into the field and help people?
yes, sir. Appreciate that question, and I know it's not an answer that people want to hear, but it will be 2024 before those projects are actually materializing. So what we will need to do is start educating potential recipients about what the eligibility requirements are, and if they think they fall within those requirements, here are some steps you can take to be prepared, including if you need to go ahead and make repairs and you're able to do that. We are going to recommend to the board that we do a reimbursement program. So it's a little challenging administratively, but there are going to be a lot of people who fall into that category, so we think it's the right thing to take on, and so reimbursement is a possibility.
Okay, so people, if they are fixing it right now, just out of pocket or with whatever means they have, and they're eligible for these funds, they could submit, okay.
Well-
We'll have a process for them.
Yes, sir. I started to say insurance, but that'd be a duplication of benefits, so strike that. But that's right. If they have to make repairs and they're able to do that somehow, we can potentially reimburse them for that.
Yeah, Commissioner Greenwell. Oh, and then Commissioner Sandelli.
I wanted to go back a little bit to the Civic Center. Both commissioners, thank you for bringing that up. It's actually one of the things that I did talk with Glenn about in the briefing, was that a possibility. So with Kevin's question, I would really hope we do look into that and see if there is possibility of that. So just wanted to at least bring that back up. So thank both of you for doing that.
Yes, sir.
Sandelli?
Glenn, thank you for you and the team for pulling all of this together in a relatively short period of time. It's pretty complex. I do think, getting it to the people that I work with, and I think this one-page sheet that you is probably as concise as you can get and pretty easy to communicate. I do agree with the housing and infrastructure focus. I mean, I think that's where the majority of this is going. What I was concerned about, and I expressed this to you in our briefing, was the planning side. Planning came up a number of different times in the conversation, and when you look at the allocation sheet that was handed out, it's rather modest. I think it should be more robust. How we play with those numbers, I just want to express my feelings again, because if the housing and the infrastructure, if you're not doing the planning right, this is all going to really support our workforce house, our community, but our workforce in a lot of ways. And that goes to the jobs piece, which I understand why it's just not a part of this because of some of the nuances in there. So we have individual pieces, but I always look at what's this going to produce end game. And so the planning piece is very important to me. So we can discuss further. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Wesh.
Glenn, under the voluntary residential buyout program, does the county then become the record title holder to the land, or is that run to the state or federal government?
So it would be the county. I think the nuance there, Richard, is that we would propose to work with the municipalities to put program agreements in place that if they want to undertake those purchases within their jurisdiction, they would sign off on the ones that they want to see purchased, and they would become the owner of record. But for unincorporated Lee County, we would assume the maintenance responsibilities for those properties.
And then we'd be required to execute some type of restricted covenant against future development, correct? Presumably.
That's right. Other than sort of passive sort of recreation opportunities, green space, that kind of thing, you can't really redevelop the lot per se. That's right. It's a little more flexible than buyouts under FEMA programs, but it's still very restrictive.
Good question. Yeah. All right. Any further questions then? Mr. County Manager, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Glenn, great job today in taking us through what is a very complicated process. But Commissioners, so first question we have of you, shall we proceed with the draft action plan and program design as outlined today? And in addition to what was outlined today, include the cities and the stakeholder and public engagement meetings, immediately solicit staff augmentation and implementation vendor, add funding for behavioral health under the public services category, and review the use of funds for the Civic Center as a hurricane shelter.
I think that captures everything everybody mentioned today, right? Anything left out from that? I think you got it.
So, Commissioners, if you have consensus, we will proceed accordingly.
Yeah.
Very good.
I think you captured it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, then, seeing no further business before us, we're adjourned. Thank you, guys.